I woke to a cold hand gripping my ankle, and when I looked down, it was my own hand pulling me under the bed. The room was too familiar, and that's what made it wrong. I stepped inside, and my breath caught. It was my childhood bedroom, exactly as I remembered it. The faded wallpaper with little stars, the stuffed animals lined up neatly on the shelf, even the scuffed wooden floorboards creaked in the same way. My legs felt weak as I moved closer, running my fingers over the desk, where I used to sit and draw. It wasn't just similar, it was mine. Then I saw the photograph on the dresser. My stomach turned cold. It was a picture of me, a short, maybe 7 years old, sitting on the porch of my childhood home. But I wasn't alone. Behind me stood a figure I didn't recognize, their face stretched into a smile that was too wide, too full of teeth. I didn't remember anyone being in that photo. The air in the room shifted, growing colder, heavier. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it whisper, faint at first, then louder. My name, over and over. It sounded like my childhood voice, calling from somewhere in the room. Come out, it said, the words turning jagged and low. I've been waiting. I froze under the blanket, my pulse racing. Slowly, I reached for the lamp on the bedside table and flicked it on. I turned toward the mirror on the wall, and my heart stopped. My reflection wasn't there. Instead, the stranger from the photograph stared back at me, grinning, their head tilting in a way that made my stomach churn. The lamp flickered once, then went out. I wasn't alone anymore. The lamp flickered back to life, but the light seemed weaker, casting long, restless shadows that crawled across the walls. I was staring at the mirror, at the face that wasn't mine, but knew me too well. It grinned wider, its teeth glistening, as if enjoying my confusion. My breath hitched, and I couldn't bring myself to move. Don't you remember me? The figure whispered, though its mouth didn't move. The voice was eerily quiet, like it had been praying. Soft, familiar, almost playful, like an old friend teasing me. But there was something else beneath. It had something sharp and jagged that sent a shiver down my spine. I blinked, and the mirror was empty again. Just my wide-eyed reflection staring back, pounded in my ears, drowning out the silence of the room. I told myself it was a trick of light, exhaustion maybe, but the air felt wrong, thick and electric, like a storm was brewing inside the walls. I turned back toward the bed, ready to leave this place, but stopped cold. The dresser was different now. The stranger was still there, but they were no longer behind me. We were sitting in the chair by the bed, facing the camera, their eyes locked on mine. A low creak broke the stillness. My head snapped toward the chair by the bed, the same one from the photo. It was empty, but it rocked ever so slightly, as if someone had just stood up. And then I felt it, a cold, damp breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my scream caught in my throat, darkness pressing in closer. But from somewhere deep in the shadows, I heard it again. Don't you remember me? I stumbled out of the first room, heart hammering, desperate to escape the suffocating air. The hallways seemed longer than before, stretching impossibly far, with dim, flickering lights casting jagged shadows across the floor. Doors lined the corridor, each numbered but none in order, though the hallway itself had forgotten where it led. As I hurried toward the second room, I heard it, the faint squeak of wheels. My pace slowed. Ahead, a maid pushed a cart stacked with neatly folded towels. Something about her seemed off. Her movements were jerky, too mechanical, as though she were a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Then I saw her shadow. It moved faster than her, stretching across the walls like spilled ink, curling toward me. I quickened my pace, the air growing colder with every step. Reaching the door to the second room, I flung it open and slammed it behind me. Relief was fleeting. The room wasn't a room at all, but a prison cell. Every detail was familiar. The walls were painted black. The ceiling was stained. There was no furniture. Mauled. Same warped, endless stretch of doors. I turned back to the door I'd entered through, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse pounded in my ears as the sound of squeaking wheels grew louder behind me. I spun around, and there she was, the maid again, her cart now empty, her shadow crawling along the ceiling like a living thing. "You've already been here," she whispered, her voice brittle and hollow. Then, just as suddenly, she was gone. The hallway shuddered, the walls seeming to close in. I ran, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't find an end or a way out. The hallway was alive, and it wanted me to stay. Forever. The door behind me slammed shut with a finality that made my stomach drop. The room was bare, almost sterile, except for a clock hanging on the wall and a single wooden chair in the center. The clock's ticking was loud, unnaturally so, like a hammer striking metal. I glanced at its face. The hands didn't move. The sound pressed into my skull, filling the space with an unbearable weight. I sat in the chair, unsure what else to do, but as soon as I did, the air shifted. The walls seemed to tremble, groaning as if alive. Slowly, they began to move inward, inch by inch. The ticking grew faster, louder, matching the pounding of my heart. I tried to stand, but my body refused to move. My limbs felt weighed down, as if invisible chains were wrapped around me. Shadows pooled at my feet, thick and oily, their edges curling upward. Fingers. The skeletal hands reached for me, their sharp tips dragging across my skin, leaving icy trails. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. The hands climbed higher, clawing at my legs, pulling me deeper into the darkness. My chest tightened, my vision narrowing as they gripped my throat. Then, in a moment of desperate clarity, I willed myself to move. With a force that felt impossible, I broke free, staggering to my feet. The shadows recoiled, with a deafening hiss, as the block shattered, the pieces scattering like shards of black glass. The room fell silent, but the oppressive air lingered. I stumbled to the door, my legs trembling, and threw it open. Instead of the hallway, I was standing in a dense, moonlit forest. The trees loomed high, their twisted branches reaching for me like the shadows had. Behind me, the door slammed shut, and vanished, leaving me alone in the eerie stillness. The forest dissolved around me as if swallowed by shadows, and I stumbled forward into another room. The shift was so sudden it felt like falling into a dream or a trap. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, masked poorly by something sweet. A long dining table stretched before me, covered in glistening dishes of every kind. The food looked fresh, vibrant even, but the smell gave it away. It was rotting. I froze when I saw them, figures seated all along the table. They weren't human, not entirely. Mannequin-like forms dressed in fine clothes sat stiffly, their faces frozen mid-bite. Their expressions were twisted, mouths gaping in silent screams. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, trying not to gag on the stench. A soft, scratchy tune began playing, and my gaze darted to the corner. A record player hadn't noticed before spun slowly. The melody warped and uneven. The mannequins shifted. Their heads turned toward me in unison, the sound of their movement like splintering wood. My breath hitched as one of them raised a hand, beckoning me to sit. "Join us," it rasped, its voice a garbled mess of overlapping tones. It sounded hungry? "No," I stammered, stepping back. My refusal seemed to anger them. The food on the table began to collapse in on itself, rotting rapidly, black mold spreading like fire. The mannequins followed suit, their porcelain-like skin cracking, crumbling, until their bodies dissolved into swarms of writhing insects. They spilled onto the floor, surging toward me. I bolted for the door, yanking it open just as the swarm reached my feet. Darkness swallowed me whole. The air was colder now, and I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate. It wasn't mine. I wasn't alone anymore. The darkness faded, and I was in another room, bare and lifeless, with 4 blank walls and a small bed in the corner. The air was still, almost too quiet, as if waiting for something to happen. My breaths came shallow, my legs trembling as I stepped further inside. I sat on the bed, the mattress sagging beneath me. That's when I noticed it. Words began to etch themselves into the walls, one by one, as if an invisible hand were carving them in. At first, they were meaningless phrases, scrambled, cryptic, but as I stared, they began to take shape, forming sentences that hit me like a punch to the chest. You should have helped. You lied. You left them to suffer. I gasped, the words twisting into accusations only I could understand. They knew things. Things. I'd never spoken aloud. My secrets, my regrets, my darkest fears. The etching grew faster, the words overlapping until the walls were covered. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs, and the words began to drip. Thick, black liquid poured from the carvings, pooling around my feet. I scrambled to my feet, backing away as the dripping words transformed. Faces pushed through. The liquid walls, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes fixed on me. My chest tightened, with sheer terror as the faces twisted, their features distorted but hauntingly familiar. They were people I knew, people I had failed. I ran to the door and grabbed the knob. Pain seared through my palm like fire. I screamed, stumbling back as the mark burned into my skin. Behind me, the bleeding faces were crawling, free from the walls. They were coming for me. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I lunged for the door again, ignoring the pain, then wrenched it open. The room behind me dissolved into darkness, and I stepped into whatever nightmare awaited. Next, I stepped through the door and into what felt like a surveillance room. The walls were covered with cameras, their lenses all pointed directly at me. Beneath them, TV screens flickered, displaying distorted footage that made my stomach churn. The air buzzed with static, and a faint clicking sound filled the room. The cameras were moving. The screens showed me in the previous rooms, but the images weren't quite right. They were warped, shaky, like a memory stretched too thin. There I was, cowering in the corner of the room, with the dripping walls, but on the screen I wasn't scared. I was laughing, my head tilted back, as the black liquid poured over me. One screen caught my eye. It showed me standing in the dining hall, but I wasn't running from the mannequins. Silent, frozen stares. My hands trembled as I backed away, but the clicking cameras followed me. Then, one screen flickered and went blank before returning to life. It showed this room, the one I was standing in now. My blood ran cold as I saw myself, staring at the cameras, just as I was. But the version of me on the screen wasn't scared. It leaned closer, looking straight into the camera, and mouthed the words, "You don't belong here." The cameras in the room clicked erratically, spinning and jerking, as if something unseen was forcing them to move. Then, all at once, they stopped. Every screen went black, except for one. My breath caught in my throat. The screen showed the concierge standing outside the door, his face pale, his eyes empty. He raised a single finger to his lips in a shushing gesture. And then the door behind me began to creak open. The door creaked open behind me, and I stepped through, half expecting another hall of horrors. But this room was different. It was empty, unnervingly so, with walls as smooth and white as porcelain. At its center stood a single mirror, tall and ornate, its golden frame etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe when I looked too closely. Across from the mirror was a door, featureless and without a handle. I moved toward the mirror cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Wrong. Suffering had drained the life from them. Their eyes were sunken, pleading, and their lips moved, silently, as if screaming words I couldn't hear. A faint knock echoed from the door behind me, the one with no handle. I froze. The knock came again, louder, sharper, glass, their mouth contorting into a silent scream. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Don't let it in!" the reflection shrieked, though no sound reached my ears. The knocking escalated into frantic pounding, each thud reverberating through the room like a drumbeat. I turned toward the door, but it remained unmoving, its smooth surface betraying no sign of whatever was on the other side. Then, the pounding stopped. Silence fell, suffocating and absolute. A voice, soft and close. I whispered in my ear, "You're already inside." I spun around to face the mirror, but it was empty. No reflection, just the bare, empty room, staring back at me. And then the door began to open, slowly. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. My back pressed against the smooth, handleless door, my chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The mirror loomed before me, its frame shimmering with an unnatural glow. The silence in the room was oppressive, a thick, heavy blanket that wrapped around me. And then, I felt it, a small, cold object in my pocket. I reached in with trembling fingers and pulled out a key, simple and unmarked, yet it felt heavy with meaning. The key was drawn to the mirror, as though an unseen force was guiding it, its own, fitting it into a small, hidden slot at the base of the frame. The second it clicked into place, the glass rippled like water and the reflection vanished. Instead, the surface revealed a dark void, swirling with shadows that writhed and pulsed as if alive. A voice came from everywhere and nowhere, soft, intimate, yet chillingly detached. Step through and leave it all behind, or stay and become part of it. Regardless, the shadows in the room began to stir. They seeped from the corners, curling around my ankles, their icy grip tightening with every second. My body screamed for me to move, to run, but the void pulled at me, calling me closer. My mind raced with questions, but there was no time for answers. "No!" I screamed, lunging forward. The void seemed to open, and I stumbled into its dark embrace. The cold enveloped me, pulling me deeper and deeper until the room, the mirror, and even the voice faded away. I was falling, weightless and alone, into a darkness so complete, it felt like I was ceasing to exist. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was only beginning. I awoke sprawled on the lobby floor, my limbs heavy, my breath shallow, thicker, colder, like a storm had swept through the building. Slowly, I pushed myself upright. Everything looked the same as when I'd first entered. The grand desk, the dusty chandeliers. But something was unmistakably wrong, as though the shadows had grown bolder. The concierge stood behind the desk, his once display face now twisted into a grin. It wasn't welcoming. "Ah, you're back," he said, his voice calm, almost pleased. He slid a leather, bound the logbook toward me. "Sign out, if you would." I reached for the pen with trembling hands, but the moment I opened the book, my stomach dropped. My name was already there, scrawled over and over, in increasingly erratic handwriting. Each signature seemed more desperate, the ink smeared, the lines trembling as if written in a panic. "What is this?" I whispered, backing away. The concierge's smile widened. "Everyone signs, everyone comes back. This is where nightmares live." I turned to run, but the air itself pushed against me, forcing me to look toward the lobby mirror. My reflection wasn't my own. It was the stranger, the figure from the photograph, staring back at me with that awful grin. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass as its lips moved silently. "Your room is ready," the concierge said. The mirror shattered, and I felt the pull, the inescapable draw of the nightmare pulling me back. I didn't scream. There was no point. The hotel always had room for one more. The cycle of fear. The protagonist is trapped in a repeating nightmare, illustrating how fear and guilt consume endlessly. Loss of identity, the shifting mirrors and reflections, symbolize the erosion of self, as the protagonist, estranged, becomes one with the horrors. Existential dread. The hotel represents an eternal prison for unresolved fears and sins, a space where escape is an illusion. I woke to icy fingers wrapped around my ankle, yanking me toward the edge of the bed. My breath caught as I saw it. A shadow, taller than the ceiling, leaning closer. It didn't have eyes, but I knew it was watching me. I stared at my phone, scrolling through the call log again. Nothing. No record of the call, no missed numbers, not even a notification. It was as if it had never happened. But the voice, cold and deliberate, still echoed in my mind. "Don't look outside." The tapping at the window resumed, soft, rhythmic, like fingernails against glass. Phone trembling in my hand. My reflection in the darkened screen caught my eye. Something wasn't right. The movement was delayed, just a fraction of a second behind my own, but enough to make my stomach drop. Heart pounding, I forced myself to look toward the window. The blinds swayed slightly, though. No breeze stirred in the room, dragging them shut. My reflection in the glass stared back, but there was a wrongness in its eyes, too sharp, too intent. I stumbled back, swallowing the scream rising in my throat. Shutting the blinds didn't stop the tapping, which now seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere. Desperate to escape the sound, I bolted to the bathroom, gripping the sink for stability. When I glanced at the mirror, my breath hitched. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and terrified, but its lips were moving, whispering words I couldn't hear. Morning brought no relief. My phone rang just as I reached for it, but the screen went black before I could answer. When I tried to call the number back, an automated voice replied, "This number does not exist." I dropped the phone, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. As I moved through the house, tiny details gnawed at my sanity. A chair pushed out I hadn't touched, a photograph on the wall, slightly askew. The air felt thick, as if something unseen lingered just behind me. That night, I locked every door, checked every corner, and turned every light on. Still, the oppressive feeling didn't leave. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of an unseen presence pressing down on me. The phone rang again. My hands shook as I answered, the number unrecognizable. Before I could speak, a voice filled my ear. Not through the phone, but so close it felt like someone was standing behind me. "It's already inside," it hissed. The line went dead, leaving the room unnervingly silent. My chest tightened as I turned slowly, scanning the dim space around me. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place, but the oppressive weight of being watched bore down on me. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, a shadow moved. It wasn't the shifting of light or my imagination. It was deliberate, a slow, creeping motion. Whatever it was waiting for me to notice. I woke up with a jolt, the chill of the air sharper than it should have been. My bedroom door, which I locked before crawling under the covers, was wide open. My heart raced as I scanned the dim hallway beyond, shadows stretching unnaturally long. I forced myself to get up, convincing myself it was just forgetfulness. But the gnawing sense of unease wouldn't fade. Later, my phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. A new message. My hands trembled. As I read it, the characters jagged and foreign, a language I didn't recognize. I couldn't decipher the meaning, but the sensation of wrongness hit me like a punch to the chest. My head throbbed, just looking at it. Before I could react, the message deleted itself, vanishing as though it was never there. I glanced at the mirror in the hallway. My reflection met my gaze but didn't seem quite right. It lingered, staring a beat too long as I turned away. I froze, breath caught in my throat. When I dared to look back, my reflection was perfectly normal, moving with me. Normal, but it wasn't. I could feel it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The walls felt closer, the shadows heavier. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "You shouldn't have looked." Was this? Desperation clawed at me. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. My hands trembled as I dialed a friend, like breathing. Guttural growl. I dropped the phone, my stomach twisting. I grabbed my coat and ran to the nearest cafe, desperate to escape the house. The soft hum of conversation there felt like a lifeline. I connected to the Wi-Fi, ready to send a message to someone who could help. Before I could type, my phone buzzed again. "Why did you leave?" The cafe suddenly felt colder. My fingers went numb as I stared at the text. I bolted home, dread filling every step. Trap. My breath hitched. I stepped inside, but the air inside wasn't just cold. It felt alive, watching. That night I dreamed, or at least, I think it was a dream. Tall and featureless, its outline writhing like static on an old TV. It leaned closer, the air vibrating with its presence. Another. I woke, gasping for air, sweat drenching my body. My arms stung, and when I looked down, faint, jagged scratches crisscrossed my skin. My pulse roared in my ears as I stared at them, trying to understand. The whispers from the dream seemed to linger in the corners of the room, just out of earshot. The house felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely my own anymore. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, and every reflection watched me with hollow eyes. I blinked, unsure if I was still. Hey, dreaming. Reality and nightmare felt indistinguishable now. Something was here. Something wanted me. The notification light blinked on my phone, and I hesitated before picking it up. My call log was, yes, blank, but there was a single voicemail waiting. My thumb hovered over the play button. The air. I felt heavy, my chest tight, as if pressing it would unleash something I couldn't take back. I hit play. Static crackled first, faint and distant, like an old radio struggling to tune in. Then came my voice, or at least, it sounded like me. The words were familiar, fragments of conversations I'd had over the past week, but they were wrong, twisted. The tone was cold, venom, dripping with malice. I'm fine, my voice sneered, though I never said it like that. Everything is perfect. The words grew darker, sharper, things I hadn't said but now heard in my voice. It doesn't belong. I don't belong. My stomach churned. The static returned, swelling until it became a low, guttural growl that rattled the phone speaker. I dropped it, backing away as though the device itself were alive. My phone vibrated once more, the screen flashing. Voicemail deleted. It was gone, erased, as if it had never existed. A horrible realization crept in, a thought I couldn't shake. This wasn't just a haunting. Something wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to become me. The shadows moved first, subtle at first, then deliberate, stretching long and thin across the walls, curling toward me like tendrils. I turned on every light, but it didn't matter. The darkness shifted unnaturally, drawn to me. In the mirror, my reflection began moving out of sync. It didn't follow my gestures, but mimicked something else entirely, tilting its head, staring at me with an intensity I couldn't return. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure from my dream standing in the hallway, but when I spun to face it, the space was empty. My skin crawled, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. Time began to blur. I woke up on the couch with no memory of falling asleep. My phone was in my hand, though I hadn't touched it. I checked the time and realized hours had passed without me noticing. I wasn't alone anymore. Whatever was here, it was growing bolder, closer. The phone rang again, and this time I didn't want to answer it. The number was the same. Blank. Wrong. Impossible. My shaking fingers hit accept before I could stop myself. Hello? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The reply made my blood run cold. It wasn't distorted this time. It was my voice. You don't belong here, it said. I need to come back. I dropped the phone, but the voice didn't stop. It filled the room, coming from the walls, the air itself, like a chant. Then, from the kitchen, I heard my voice again, clear and unmistakable. Help me. Something was waiting for me, something wearing my voice. The text appeared as if my phone was waiting for me to pick it up. It's time. Before I could process it, the screen flickered and went black. No matter how many times I pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. My stomach twisted as the silence in the house. I shookened, pressing against me like an unseen weight. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They started slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My breath caught. I was alone. I hadn't gone upstairs all day. Above me, stopping occasionally as if it was listening. The air turned stifling, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The walls seemed to lean inward, the ceiling lower than it had ever been. I backed into the corner of the room, every instinct telling me not to go upstairs, but I couldn't stay still. The footsteps grew louder, and then, impossibly, they came from the hallway outside the room. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife with trembling hands. The sound stopped. The silence was worse. I felt its presence before I saw it. The temperature dropped, and the air itself seemed to hum with static. It was me. Or at least, it was something that looked like me. Its eyes, though, cold, sharp, and filled with a malice that felt ancient. Its lips curled into a mockery of a smile. but the corners of its mouth trembled, as if holding back something terrible. "You don't belong," it said in my voice. "You never did. This life was mine." The knife slipped from my hand as it moved closer. Every step it took felt like the room was tilting, drawing me into its orbit. My chest tightened with a dread so visceral I could hardly breathe. It lunged. The moment its fingers touched my skin, everything went black. There was no falling, no sense of time, just an endless, suffocating void. When I woke, the world was wrong. The house was eerily silent, the colors muted as if the light had drained from them. I stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the sink to steady myself. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. Its smile was too wide, its eyes too bright. My face remained still as it leaned closer, mocking me silently. I reached out, and my hand hit the mirror's surface with a hollow thud. My reflection didn't flinch. And the thing wearing my face? Screaming silently behind the surface. I pressed my hands against the cold surface of the mirror, my breath fogging the glass. The reflection of my world stood just beyond reach, vibrant and alive, while I was trapped in this hollow, silent void. I pounded on the barrier, screamed until my throat burned, but no sound. The thing that wore my face moved through my life effortlessly. It answered my phone, laughed with my friends, and slipped into my routines like it had always belonged. From the mirror, watched, helplessly, as my life became its own. Days, or what felt like days, blurred into an endless stretch of nothingness. The void offered. No sense of time, only the endless torment of watching my world continue without me. Every now and then, it would glance at the mirror, its gaze locking with mine. Its smile widened, knowing I was still trapped, still watching. One day, the thing picked up my phone and answered a call. Its face darkened as it whispered into the receiver, its voice low and deliberate. I strained to hear, dread pooling in my stomach. "Don't look outside." The words sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced as I realized what it was doing. The cycle was beginning again. It wasn't content with stealing just my life. It wanted more. I screamed and clawed at the glass, desperate to warn whoever was on the other end of the line, but it was useless. At the edges of my skin, I stare out from the mirror, my existence reduced to a silent observer. As the days pass, I notice something new. The entity doesn't just answer calls now. It watches. Its eyes linger on the darkened screens of phones, on blank television sets, on reflective surfaces of all kinds. As I stare into the void, my final thought echoes endlessly. This will happen again. It will happen to someone else. If you dare share this story, but beware. Every retelling brings it closer to the surface. Are you sure you're alone as you finish reading this? Or is something watching from the reflection, waiting for you to notice?